All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 8, The Market Revolution. So, in this chapter, we're going to focus a little bit more on themes related to the economy, to things like technology, and to things like society. In some of the previous chapters, we had focused a lot on the politics, namely going through the presidents of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera. Here, we're kind of looking at a different aspect. And so, what goes on in chapter 8 is essentially a process that is occurring in the background, essentially from the period 1815 to 1860. Right? We can think about this as a process taking place in the background. And that is to say that there was a lot of significant change that took place in those years. Not just change in the United States, but really change around the world, namely a process known as the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is arguably the most significant change that human beings have ever gone through. I think the only other comparable example is the agricultural revolution, where people made the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. That brought huge change to the way that our species lives. The Industrial Revolution was very similar. Um, to simplify the Industrial Revolution, if we just have to put a simple definition to it, we can just say that it changed the way goods are produced. So it changes the way that you make stuff and distributed. And as far as the Industrial Revolution, where it happens first and how it spreads, it has its origins in Great Britain. And if we're thinking about, the Industrial Revolution in its early years, 1750 is sometimes kind of the most simple date to say when the Industrial Revolution starts. But it doesn't come to the United States until maybe about the 1800s, and maybe even a little later than that. Again, here the date 1815. This is sometimes helpful because this is when the War of 1812 ends. But again, with something like the Industrial Revolution, when you're looking at economic changes, technological changes, societal changes, a lot of these things don't just happen in one year, right? There's sort of a process that takes place over time. So, what is the Industrial Revolution and why is it so important? Well, the Industrial Revolution more or less comes down to one invention, and it's going to be the consequences of this one invention that ends up reverberating throughout society and reverberating around the world, and that is steam power and steam power via the steam engine. So we might say that the steam engine and steam power, which is what the steam engine produces, are, we'll say, the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. So that is to say that what the Industrial Revolution does is that it changes the source of power for which goods are produced and distributed. And again, not to be so dramatic about it, but essentially, if you look at the beginning of our species, human beings, we were able or we could harness four different sources of power. The first one is human. And the easiest way to think about this is actually in transportation. It's the way that things are distributed. So people can go from point A to point B by walking, right? Using human power. We were able to harness animal power, and this was actually came with the the agricultural revolution and our ability to domesticate animals. We can ride a horse from point A to point B. We can construct something akin to, well, not akin, but we can build boats and harness wind power. Think about some of the earlier chapters. How did Christopher Columbus arrive to the New World? Jumped in a boat with a big sail. The wind blew him across the ocean. And then the last is water power. You might think about the current of an ocean or, going down a river or something along those lines. So human beings could get from point A to point B using all of these things for, up until this point, almost 10,000 years. And again, you can still do the same thing with the way that things are produced, right? How would somebody have made something, using a textile, for example, or a shirt? Well, a person can sew it together, and that would be a way of producing a certain textile. But there were also contraptions that existed that you could hook it up to an animal, right? You can build a contraption, something like a loom, tie an animal to it and have it walk in a circle. Or maybe a little bit more familiar would be something like a windmill, right? Windmills harvest wind power to typically grind grain, or water wheel, right? You might have some sort of structure or contraption, something like a loom, for example, that makes textiles, and put a water wheel inside a river, and then the water flows and it spins. So these were sources of power that people had utilized since, at least in terms of animal power, since the beginning of civilization. The significant step in the Industrial Revolution, and where steam power comes in, is that these things can be replaced by the steam engine. And it's no longer these, what we might call, natural sources of power. That'd be a good way of putting it. But for the steam engine to operate, it uses coal, and coal is a fossil fuel, right? Coal is a fossil fuel. And so, the way that a steam engine works, and, again, this is going to be not very well drawn, but, essentially you have a source of water, right? And the water needs a source of heat. So there's some sort of heating going on, with coal. But the idea is that as you boil water, it starts to build up steam pressure, right? And if you ever boil water for tea, or if you boil water for whatever reason, you know that when you boil water, it creates pressure. And the idea is that you heat up water to the point where it creates a ton of pressure, and then you have a piston. And as soon as enough pressure is there, that piston then opens up, and all of that pressure is entered into, some sort of, device. And typically there's, some sort of piston that is attached to this. So you might have, I don't know, however a piston would end up being drawn. But, the idea is that you heat up water, it builds up steam pressure, you open up the valve, and the pressure pushes a device, forward, a piston upwards, and then it comes back down, and you close it again, and then you build up steam pressure, and then you open it again. So it provides this motion of going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And so with that, now, as long as you have enough coal or enough fossil fuel, you can pretty much power something 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? And it's the ability for this steam engine to replace all of these things that fundamentally transforms our society. Another way to look at it, again, to kind of give the big picture of why the Industrial Revolution is so important, is that in some sense, this is the ability for people to overcome the natural world. Right? It's true that we relied on natural sources of power before, but it's not that we relied on them, it's that we were constrained by them. We didn't have anything else. And so, if you look at something like a transportation, right? As a human walking from point A to point B, you're going to eventually get tired. You're going to need to rest. You're going to need to eat. Same thing with an animal. You can ride a horse only so far. They need to eat. They're going to get tired. Think about wind power. If you're Columbus and you jump in your boat and the wind isn't blowing, you're not going anywhere, right? There's nothing that you can really do. You're constrained by the natural world, and same thing with water power. One of the problems for, if you're navigating on a river, you jump in a boat, you go on a river, you're just going to go where the current goes, right? You don't really have any say over that. Well, the ability to utilize steam engines and inventions like trains and things like steamboats or steamships, this is a way for us to overcome these type of natural obstacles or overcome the natural world that has constrained us for such a long time. So that's the big picture of what the Industrial Revolution is, right? The shift from natural sources of power to essentially fossil fuels or engine powered, however you want to put it. Um, Happening in Great Britain first, then coming over to the United States and having having other impacts. Now, an important point to make that when it does hit the US, when the Industrial Revolution does come to the US and provide a lot of these different types of transformations, it hits the country very, very differently. As far as the North is concerned, the North is going to more directly utilize industrial technology. So this is in the form of things like factories, trains. We would say, or we would just use the term industrialize. All right, for a society to industrialize, it means to kind of make this shift over to to steam power, and then later on petroleum and other other types of fossil fuels. Whereas in the South did not become did not industrialize directly, but was related to it. And we could say about the South as the South came to rely on the industrial North. And of course, one of the big things that we'll talk about a little bit later in this chapter is the relationship between the South, cotton, and the industrial North. So, factories, trains, industry, that was going on in the North. South really didn't have a lot of factories. I mean, for all practical purposes, you could say the South had no factories, very few trains. So this process hits the hits the country very differently. So section two here. So that's the introduction to the chapter. Section two here, early republic economic development. We can see an image here of the first locomotive or the first train here in 1829. Probably the first American locomotive, although I think trains were actually earlier than that. But that's what the photo is titled. And so the United States really has tremendous economic growth following this, following the early republic period and leading up until 1860. It's really a process by which the United States emerges as a global power. So it's pretty transformative. We just have a couple of statistics here to represent or illustrate some of this economic growth. So first, we're going to do exports. That is how much the United States is, shipping to other countries in 1790, and I believe this is in dollars. I want to say in 1790 it was about 20 million in terms of exports. In 1807 it was 108 million. So in the span of simply just 17 years, the number of exports is increasing by essentially fivefold. And remember from the colonial economy, that for a long time it was raw materials, go to Great Britain or go to the mother country for manufacturers. And this relationship went back and forth. But, after the United States became independent, and especially after it defeated the British in the War of 1812, it doesn't want to have this relationship anymore, right? Because here the United States is dependent. So part of this economic growth is creating an economically self-sufficient, self-sufficient country. So essentially want to do away with this old relationship. Or there it goes, it just disappears. We can also see this in the number of banks in terms of economic activity. So again, some statistics just to make things a little bit more clear. In 1820, 266 banks existed in the United States. By 1860, 1371. So in the span of 40 years, again, something like a fivefold increase in in banking. So it's not that statistics can be useful. It's not like you need to memorize these numbers or anything like that. But especially when you're measuring something like economic growth, sometimes seeing the statistics is is helpful. Now, despite the fact that there was a lot of tremendous economic growth, it didn't come at a slow and steady pace, and it wasn't always upward trending. That is to say, that the economy in the early Republic period and leading up into the American Civil War was often booms and busts, and that the economy was prone to panics and depressions. So, if we were to measure the American economy, it would go something like up and then down, down, up, down, with panics and depressions and crashes in between. So we might say that US economy was prone to ups and downs, say periods of growth and depressions. Especially when it came to new technology and speculation. Speculation is sort of the anticipation, or I mean, kind of guessing about how much certain companies or businesses are going to be worth in the future. And especially when you're hit with a lot of new technology, you don't really know like how valuable a technology like the steam engine is. And so oftentimes people get carried away speculating with new technologies and the impact that they have on the economy. And you had a lot of these, panics and depressions that occurred, in this period, right? How much is land going to be worth now with trains? How much are factories going to be worth? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, at the same time, the United States economy did have to guard against a couple of things, and so, what we mean by that is, as a relatively, I mean, as an unregulated economy, there were certainly risks involved, and we'll go ahead and just list three risks that the early republic economy had. The first one is actually speculation, so I'll go ahead and just leave that right there. Right, again, it's not knowing exactly how much certain technologies, how much they'll pay off, and so a lot of these panics are caused by over speculation in certain commodities, land, enslaved laborers, railroads, whatever it may be. Another big problem was scams, as they called it in those days, the confidence man. Confidence man as the con man. People who were, scamming people out of investments or scamming people out of money. Those things were common back then. How to guard against that. And the third thing was counterfeiting. Counterfeiting, or making fake currency. And despite all the drawbacks, despite the over speculation and the scams and the counterfeiting, the United States economy continued to grow at a pace that would put it, soon to be one of the world's greatest economies. Now, at the same time, there was an emphasis by the United States government to really kind of harness this economic growth in a nationalistic way. Here we have James Madison as early as 1815 expressing this sentiment. He has, quote, the great importance of establishing throughout our country the roads and canals which can best be executed under national authority. And we actually used the term at the very end of last chapter to illustrate this sentiment, and that was something we called the American system. There was a connection between economic growth and nationalism. It became a point of national pride to develop the American economy independently, especially if we consider the previous relationship. The colonial economy was so dependent on the mother country that colonies didn't really trade with each other. They only traded with Britain. And so after the American Revolution took place, and especially at the War of 1812, there's a sense that, to build the American economy, to build things like roads, to build things like canals, which connect the country together, it's not just for the dollars and cents, but it's a way to promote national pride, right? It's a way to promote nationalism. And those politicians that were on board with this, everything under that umbrella was called the American system. So building roads, building canals, protective tariffs, banks, any type of internal economic improvement, we typically refer to it as the American system. So what was key in order to get the American economy independent and states trading with each other and not Europeans was transportation. And that is to say that, and we'll be using a couple of these terms, revolution, because this is a time of great change, right? There's industrial revolution, transportation revolution, market revolution. You know, how many revolutions can you have? A cotton revolution. But it's a time of great change. And, you know, one of the ways in which the United States was able to build an independent economy was that internal transportation really, really improved. Um, Again, 1815 to about 1860. Messy. 1815 to 1860. And that's just to say US internal transportation significantly improved. All right. I mean, even you can say for like the first time ever, the colonies were now connected, or the colonies were on the path of becoming connected to each other. Significantly improved. Right, transportation revolution. There's a quote here kind of poking fun, I would say, at the lack of internal transportation here in 1829. This is a traveler that says, quote, so few are willing to return from the Western country because the journey is so bad. Essentially, the point here is that when Americans did move out west, they stayed there because they had such a difficult time getting there that it just wasn't even worth, wasn't even worth coming back. So there are several processes or several steps that take place in the transportation revolution. Each of these things flow relatively in chronological order, and technology plays a big role. So if we go before the steam engine, right, before the Industrial Revolution, the way that people got from point A to point B over land, anyways, was mostly on horseback or by walking, and so in terms of developing internal infrastructure, very early on, it was in the process of roads. And a significant step came when the United States Congress authorized the first federally funded road. We call this the National Road. So we're going to say this is the first federally funded, we'll call it something a little bit fancier, interstate infrastructure process. The national road would have fallen under this American system, you know, those that were in Congress that voted on it. Now, the national road was the first federally funded interstate infrastructure network, but we have to recall that for the most part in the United States, these types of projects aren't going to be as successful, and a big reason for that is federalism. You know, this is one of the big obstacles that that the United States faces in terms of building an internal infrastructure, and that is, well, if it's funded by the national government, it essentially means that all states have to chip in and pay. And the national road, for the most part, connected, you know, roughly speaking, I think it was, let's say Maryland to the Mississippi River. So this was a road that stretched from the Chesapeake Bay all the way to the Mississippi River, which, you know, as a country, it might be useful to be able to go very easily from the coast to the Mississippi. The Mississippi River was the most important river inside the United States at the time. But one of the problems is that, you know, for the states in which the road doesn't directly pass through, they don't see a direct benefit. All right. So, you know, why should Georgia help pay for a road that doesn't go through their state? And so while, yes, the national road is the first federally funded infrastructure project, we don't really have that many in US history. Instead, for the most part, it's going to be, we'll say, most improvements are state funded, right? Most states will handle their own internal infrastructure and not really leave it up to the federal government because of reasons related to federalism. But the national road is certainly worth mentioning. Now, the invention of steamships and railroads would fundamentally alter this, right? The days of horseback rides, weeks and weeks and weeks at a time to get to, places like Ohio and Detroit, those things would soon become a memory of the distant past. One thing that steamships did, and we sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but that, we had said that on rivers, especially steamboats, technically, steamboats are on rivers, steamships are on the ocean. But one thing that steamboats did was that they took rivers, and, historically, as mentioned before, if you jump on a boat in a river, you're pretty much going the direction that the river is going. They were essentially one way. I mean, it's not a street, but one way streets in terms of transport, right? So, like the Mississippi, which is the biggest and most important river in the United States, since the beginning of time, people only sailed down the Mississippi River, right? If you got in the Mississippi, you're going the way that the current is going. But thanks to the steamship, right? You take a river, sorry, and a steamboat is what I should be saying. Now you have an engine on the boat that is powerful enough to drive against the current of the river. And this suddenly transforms all waterways in the world, right? All waterways in the world now essentially to two-way streets. You can, for the very first time in human history, sail up the Mississippi River. And so this unlocks a huge amount of potential in terms of getting people and goods from point A to point B, right? You essentially have an entire new infrastructure network that is unlocked. And so one of the ways in which Americans really sought to utilize this technology was by building canals, right? In a canal, if you're not familiar, a canal is a man-made river, right? You dig a giant ditch and you build a river there. And this was helpful because, connecting rivers together meant that you could greatly increase the amount of, activity going on inside the U.S. Of all the canals that were constructed in the United States, and, quite honestly, all the canals that were built in the world, the Erie Canal was the largest and most successful canal. It was 350 miles long. I think was close to 10 times longer than the biggest canal that had ever been built at that time, and it connected essentially New York City, which is the Atlantic Ocean and the Hudson River, to the Great Lakes. It was it allowed people to sail from the Atlantic Ocean. So again, from the Atlantic Ocean, you can get stuff from Europe, you can get some from the South, you can get pretty much stuff from anywhere. Sail through New York City, up the Hudson River, across the canal, and then get to the Great Lakes. And that would allow you to get to places like Detroit and Chicago and stuff like that. So the Erie Canal really allowed for a lot of economic activity to go through New York City, which became incredibly profitable as a result of that. And it really was somewhat of an engineering marvel. The Erie Canal was kind of like it was the same as sort of landing on the moon. It was considered a great achievement. The person responsible for the invention of the steamboat, or typically who gets credit for it, is Robert Fulton. Just say credited. The invention of the steamboat. Like we said before, the significance of the steamboat is now you pretty much make every single water route a two-way street, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. And so there was a very brief canal age, right, where canals were essentially all the rage in the U.S. And, maybe this was 1820 to about 1830 or something like that. But pretty soon railroads would more or less surpass all of that. Railroads were a lot cheaper to build than canals. It didn't have to rely so much on existing geography. Just lay down a bunch of wooden slats and two, steel bars, and you pretty much have the most efficient and cheap transportation network that that you could have for that particular era. So we'll say about railroads. These were built more in the North than the South. And connected economies, people, ideas, etc. Railroads end up having a tremendous impact on not just the United States but the world. But this is coming at a time where the United States is building more railroads than anyone else around the world. And so we could talk about the impact that it had on the economy, the ability for people to trade with each other. Things like traveling, ideas, and culture are important. We could, or we might just summarize is that the North became better connected. There's some statistics that show that a trip from the East Coast to the Midwest, whereas before it could take weeks, like could take you a month to get from New York to Ohio in like the year 1790. By 1840, it takes you a couple days, right, to get there. It's cheaper, it's less expensive, it's less risky, it's less dangerous. And the railroads end up having a very profound impact on the development of American history. Part of this transportation revolution and sort of like the last iteration of it. Again, important to note that for the most part, when we talk about a lot of these changes, most of them are happening in the North. The South did have some railroads, but the Southern railroads were mostly built for exporting, right? Exporting cotton, whereas Northern railroads more or less connected Northerners together. Now, the last kind of part to this transportation revolution, it really isn't transportation, but it is sometimes included here, and that is the telegraph. If you're unfamiliar, the telegraph is a way to send communication over long distance. You connect, I think it's copper wire over long distances and using some sort of contraption in a code known as Morse code. You can send messages over long distances, and so this allowed people to be connected over long distances, not quite instantaneously, but much more instantaneously than they were before. The example that your textbook uses to illustrate this point about the travel of information and and communication is that, recall in the War of 1812, Battle of New Orleans, that happened after the war was over, and that was because communication you couldn't communicate over long distances. You had to physically send communications. So the peace treaty had been signed in the War of 1812. The war was over. But that information didn't get to New Orleans, and the Battle of New Orleans actually took place after the war was over. Well, when we get to a conflict that we'll cover here in the next couple of chapters, the Mexican-American War, that was instant, right? That the U.S. Congress could get, I mean, not quite instant, a couple hours, right? A couple hours, that they could get updates from victory in the war almost the same day that it occurred. So it's a pretty profound, transformation. There's sort of a sense from all of these things. Now, of course, it's not true, but from all of these things, from roads to canals to railroads, then to telegraphs, that the world's becoming a smaller place. Now, it's not literally becoming a smaller place, but the way that people think about distance and space, it's changing, right? Whereas, New Orleans was weeks away in terms of communication. Now with the telegraph wire, right? If there were someone to just telegraph Andrew Jackson, hey, by the way, or probably the British because they were the ones attacking, hey, the war is over. That instantaneous communication would have, changed the way that that things played out. So the world is seemingly a smaller place, right? Seemingly a smaller place. So, as far as the impacts that these technologies have, we have again another revolution. In fact, this is what the the chapter is called, right? The market revolution. And maybe the simplest way in understanding the market revolution is by looking at farmers and the way that farmers changed in this period. The market revolution was made possible by railroads. And if we think about farmers, the way that people farmed, it hadn't changed in a long time. In fact, you could look at something like a colonial farmer in 1790 and compare that to a European farmer in like the year 1500. And there wasn't all that much that changed, right? Farmers were mostly self sufficient, they grew in order to eat. So, this is what we might say is that farmers grew to consume. And that's pretty much the way that people lived for, for a long time. That's why you were in the farming business. Well, railroads plus factories change this relationship. Farmers go from growing to eat to growing to sell. Again, the market revolution can mean more broadly just the development of an American economy. But if we look at the real change, or we look at one of the major significant changes in American society, it's going from this growing to consume to growing to sell, and it's the railroads and the factories that make this possible. So, just to illustrate this point, I mean, this is pretty much the relationship that ends up developing as a result of the market revolution. So you have your farm, you have your factory. Your factory is in the city, and then you have your railroad. And it's the ability for farmers to take their food, send it to the factory, for the factories to send back stuff. And so it's the development of this relationship that we often refer to as the market revolution. Whereas before, when you didn't have that railroad and you didn't have the factories, farmers just grew their own food, they ate it. And, it was a pretty tough existence, right, before the market revolution. Low material standard of living, not really a lot of, a poor health. And, this thing really changes the way that Americans interact with each other. And once again, because the railroads and factories are built primarily in the north, when we think about the market revolution, we want to think about it as a northern phenomenon. This is something that is happening between northern farmers and northern factories. The same type of relationship does not develop in the South, right? The South has railroads, but pretty much it's cotton being exported, right? Cotton being exported. Now, there are other ways in which the market revolution, industrial revolution, whatever we want to call it, also increased the material standard of living of Northerners. And that was the ability for certain farming equipment to be mass produced, which made farmers, more efficient. One thing too that's maybe important to note about this growing to sell is that farming became competitive, right? Because if you're growing just to eat it, who cares about the quality of your food really? But if you're growing to sell it, you're competing with other farmers. And so, in this developing new relationship of the market revolution, farmers had to, they had to use some of the more updated technology and they really had to invest more. Farming became much more of a business than it was just a practice of survival, which it was in the past. So there are two inventors that are typically, cited in most, I would say, American history textbooks that contributed to, the growth in farming and the availability of certain farm equipment. Cyrus McCormick. Now, both of these people, Cyrus McCormick and John Deere, they're not necessarily the inventors of the commodities they produce. They're the ones who can mass produce them in a way that makes it affordable, right? So Cyrus McCormick, we might say, produced or maybe made available the first mass produced mechanical reaper. When you think about a reaper, think about the Grim Reaper. When you think about the Grim Reaper, think about the thing that he holds, the scythe that's used to cut down grain. Um, the mechanical reaper was something that you could attach to a horse. And so instead of going out and, cutting down all the grain with, just your scythe and, taking a lot of time doing that, you could attach it to an animal, have the animal pretty much walk across the entire field, and it was much more efficient. Again, the ability to mass produce it meant that farmers could essentially afford it. John Deere mass produced the steel plow. All right, so John Deere, he's the steel plow guy. Cyrus McCormick, the mechanical reaper. And it's the ability for these things to be affordable to farmers that really increases the agricultural output. So as farmers are going through this pretty significant change, and of course, the reason why a lot of farmers did this was because they could use the money they sold from their food to buy more stuff. On the other side, in the cities, there's rapid urbanization taking place. And we might just say that factories helped centralize populations. Because before, again, this is maybe a little bit of a before and after, things were typically made in workshops. Well, when they get put to the factories, there are much fewer of the factories, right? Workshops, there are many. Maybe this is a better way of describing this, right? How many workshops would you need in order to produce as much as a factory could produce? Well, it's probably a lot of them. And so instead of having a lot of little workshops spread out across the country, again, making stuff with their hands, now everything's being located to a central location that is much larger in scale, can produce much cheaper, much more efficiently. And so if you want a job or you want some sort of, chance at wage labor, you have to move to the cities where factories are. So this helped to draw people into into the factories. And part of the success for factories were some of the new legal and maybe economic methods of organizing such ventures. Now, we had talked earlier in earlier chapters about joint stock companies. And we have something very similar here taking place in the industrial era that helps to organize businesses along the same lines, raise revenue, reduce liability, and allow for businesses to flourish. Instead, we call this the corporation. The corporation or a corporation and a joint stock company, they're almost exactly the same thing. I mean, you could think about the corporation as being a successor to the joint stock company. But remember, the joint stock company allowed people to pool resources together. It was easier to do business. This happened during the era of trading, mercantilism and stuff like that. The corporation will just say that this is a legal entity for doing business that say makes it easier to raise money. And the way that you raise money in a corporation is by selling stocks. Protect owners from liabilities. So the part about raising money and selling stocks, that is exactly like joint stock company. But the idea here was, is it easier to get a bunch of money from one person or a small amount of money from a lot of people? Well, same thing if you want to build a factory, right? If you're looking to build a factory, is it going to be easier just to get a bunch of money from one person or get a little bit of money from a lot of people? It's a little bit of money from a lot of people. And the way that corporations do that is by selling stock. So when you buy a stock in a company, you think this factory is going to make a lot of money. You buy a stock in the company, you give the company a little bit of money, they use that to build the factory. And then as the factory becomes profitable, they give some of that back to you. So that's what a corporation helps, what it helps in terms of doing business. Another way is to protect owners from liabilities. What do they mean by that? Well, think about something like a lawsuit. If you build a factory or you build a business and I don't know, you end up poisoning all the water or killing all your customers, um, when that happens, the corporation gets sued. You don't get sued, right, as a person. So you're not individually liable for what the business does. The corporation allows people to be protected from these types of liabilities. So it ends up being one of the most preferred methods of organizing a business, makes it easy to raise money, and then also protects owners because it's the company that gets sued, right? You sue the corporation, you don't sue any actual people, right? You sue the corporation. Now, the prevalence and the growth of corporations will only increase over time, but there was a very early Supreme Court case in 1819 that weighed in on the growing influence of corporations in the early Republic period. This is Dartmouth versus Woodward. So, this was a Supreme Court case of state versus essentially corporation, right? State versus corporation. Um, the what was it? The state of New Hampshire attempted to gain control over Dartmouth College. So this was the state versus the private business. Court ruled in favor of the corporation. So it's one of those court cases that provides an example of how corporations grew in influence, or at least were, had the side of the law more firmly with them. Thomas Jefferson remarked in 1816, not particularly on this court case, but he shows, at least from his perspective, maybe some of the suspicion that he has over the growing importance of this business model, the corporation. He says, quote, I hope we shall see in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and a bid of defiance to the laws of our country. So here Thomas Jefferson is remarking, look, these corporations are already trying to challenge our government. They're trying to challenge our laws. Um, Jefferson, at least in this quote, is not on the side of the moneyed corporations. Section 3, the decline of Northern slavery and the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. So, one of the key components of the Industrial Revolution is the factory system. Now, last section, we talked a lot about the Industrial Revolution in terms of transportation, how it changed from getting to point A to point B. But the same type of transformation was made in terms of the way that things are produced. So, here we're going essentially from products that were handmade, and we're going to be using the example of textiles here. And if you're not, if you're not familiar, a textile is simply just something made out of cloth. So think about, clothing or curtains or blankets or whatever it is. Um, from handmade to factory made. And textiles are a good example because textiles are one of the first industries to really be impacted by the industrial system. So, what the Industrial Revolution meant was that before, all the clothing that people wore would have been sewn together by a person. Now you have some sort of contraption, right? A factory hooked up to a steam engine, which provides the power source for textiles and other goods to be made in mass. So, the um, the prevalence of the factory system, the rise of textile mills, amongst other things, would create a tremendous demand for cotton. Again, just kind of do the thought experiment. How many t-shirts can one person sew in a day? Well, probably not that many as compared to how many t-shirts can a factory make. Right here are some early factories in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1850. These things are going to be able to spit out thousands upon thousands of textiles as compared to the person making it in their hands. So we'll just say about textile mills, these were built in the north. We'll say about them is that they're also the first industry to adopt factory system. And this is where, I really think, this section is trying to make the connection. It's trying to make the connection between the northern economy and the southern economy. And that is to say, even though the northern economy and the southern economy become very different, the north becomes industrial, the south continues to rely on cotton and slavery, is that the two are connected, right? And that is created, these textile mills in the north created a very strong demand for cotton, right? And that's essentially the relationship that will end up, developing. In the South, they're going to provide the cotton, and in the North, right, that's where the factories are. So they're going to take the cotton, turn it into manufactured goods, and then sell it pretty much everywhere. Now, this is happening against the backdrop of a difference in the legality of slavery between the northern and southern states. And typically, when we refer to the North and the South, we use this dividing line known as the Mason-Dixon line to help us differentiate between what we identify as a northern or free state or a southern or slave state. So the Mason-Dixon line, this is actually the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And the way that the Mason-Dixon line works out is that along that line between Pennsylvania and Maryland, everything to the north is free and everything to the south is slave. So this is the dividing line between the free states and the southern states. And we mentioned some of this in an earlier chapter, but just to sort of reiterate it here is that following the American Revolution, northern states, or pretty much every state, they were able to determine for themselves the legality of slavery. And so most northern states opted for gradual emancipation. So we'll say northern states gradually got rid of slavery. So something like, everyone who is currently enslaved would remain under that condition, but their children would be free. That would be a way that you could gradually get rid of slavery, or putting an age limit on slavery once you reach a certain age. In some of the states of the Upper South, they allowed for what was called manumission. Manumission is the allowing of enslavers to let their slaves free. Manumission laws were also passed in some states, specifically the ones in the Upper South, Virginia and Maryland, were states that utilized manumission laws. And probably the most famous example of a manumission was that of George Washington, who in his will wrote that his slaves would go free. So that led to the increase of both of these things: gradual emancipation in the North, the slow move towards getting rid of slavery, and then manumission laws allowed for a growing free Black population. And in this early Republic period, we do see an increase in the number of free Black Americans that are living in the U.S. Now, the rights for free Black Americans really depended on the state. Rights depended oops. So when it came to things like voting, for example, owning property, public schooling, et cetera, you could have, you did have situations where, yes, slavery was abolished and there was a free Black population, but there could be state or local laws that restricted these other types of rights: the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to go to public schools, et cetera, et cetera. Typically, in New England, the free black population had the greatest rights, or at least we might say the fewest restrictions. But again, a lot of rights as far as the free black population was concerned was on a state by state basis. Now, the last point here is to say that, even with the growing, even with half the country moving towards gradual emancipation, even for manumission laws, even though there's a free black population that is growing, the status of slavery will be forever changed by cotton. Cotton ends up, and especially the relationship between cotton and the Industrial Revolution, ends up making slavery much more profitable than what it was, and creates a demand for slavery that didn't exist, or at least was declining at the conclusion of the American Revolution and around the constitutional period. So cotton, not only did it provide, we'll say, northern factories with raw materials, it would create a demand, and in some cases, reliance on slavery. Now, one of the bottlenecks as far as production was concerned was removing the seeds. And this is where technological innovation comes through. Eli Whitney, he is the inventor of a device called the cotton gin. And it removed the seeds much quicker. Right, much quicker. And so you combine these two things together. You have the fact that these factories are now arising in the north. They can manufacture the cotton, I don't know, 100 times faster than what you could make with your hands. Here, you have a device that can remove the seeds 100 times faster than before. And what this does, and it's somewhat ironic because Eli Whitney was a northern, and part of his invention was to make the process to remove the seeds from the cotton a little bit easier on the lives of those who were enslaved. It's ironic because when you can do all of those things more efficiently, it just creates more of a demand for slavery. And just like we had mentioned up here, the cotton gin just contributes to this, to this issue. So remove the seeds much quicker. We might say creates demand for more slaves. So it's not just the population of the free black population increases, it's also that the enslaved population increases, right? Both of those are true. It's not zero sum. So free black population increases and the slave population also increases. Just to provide a little bit of context as far as cotton is concerned, we talked about some statistics in the last section to show us how the economy is growing. In 1815, the United States produced 150,000 bales of cotton. Because of industrialization, the rise of the factory system, the cotton gin. Also take into consideration the railroads, steamships. You can transport this stuff a lot easier. By 1859, it was up to 4.5 million. Right? It's important to note that as cotton increases in the United States, so too does slavery. Right? So too does slavery. We have a quote here from the Census Bureau. It says, quote, "The manufacture of cotton constitutes the most striking feature of the industrial history of the last 50 years." So arguably, you could say that the growth of cotton and slavery along with it was arguably the most important economic development in this pre-Civil War period, despite the fact that when we think about technological and economic growth, we typically associate it with the North. But one thing that this chapter or this section really wants to show is that the relationship between the growth of northern industry, the growth of cotton in the South, the growth of slavery, that the two are interlinked. To go back to this point here, and that is to say, yes, the North and South became a lot more different than each other, but they also became more dependent, right? And it's almost the fact that they were different that allowed that relationship to develop going forward. Now, in an earlier section, we had mentioned that the global slave trade was banned in 1808, and that is, that's certainly still the case. But with cotton, grew an internal slave trade. That is state to state, despite the importation of slavery, the importation of slaves, importation of enslaved people, being banned. Section 4, changes in labor organization. So one of the fundamental changes of the Industrial Revolution is where goods are made. Historically, many different workshops, littered the countryside, and now production is all being centralized into one area, right? The factory system. So this section goes through some of the processes by which this change takes place, how it affected the economy, and how it affected the people involved. So the workshop, we might just call this a pre-industrial location of production. And we might just want to keep in mind that there are many workshops, that the workshops are, typically stuff was handmade, and it required a certain degree of skilled labor, right? If you're going to build a pair of shoes from your hands, you have to know a little bit, about that. Now, in the workshop system, there had been some manufacturers or producers that were becoming a little bit more efficient. Workshops tended to use or started to use more what was known as the quote unquote putting out system or the put out system. And this was a way for workshops to maybe divide up the unskilled repetitive tasks. I will say by sending materials to farm families. All right, so what does this mean? Well, let's say that you are a shoemaker, and one of the processes of making shoes is cutting the sole out, right? And that part doesn't really require a lot of skill. You just draw, whatever the sole of the shoe is, and then you cut it out. Pretty much anyone could do that. And so as a way to make things more efficient, what workshops would sometimes do is take these very repetitive, kind of unskilled parts to the steps of production or stages of production, send all those materials out to a family. They would do it themselves, get paid a little bit of money in the off time, and then eventually send it back to the workshop. Another good example of this was spinning thread, right? So if you're a textile worker, if you put together carpets or blankets or anything like that, you might take a bunch of wool or other material, send it out to a farm family. They can spin it into thread pretty easily, and then they would send the thread back to you. And so this was a way of dividing up labor to make it more efficient. Now, when the first factories are brought to the United States, or when the first factories just hit not just the United States but Great Britain, they're going to completely change all of this, right? All of this will eventually be replaced from the workshop to the putting out system. Everything is replaced. The two individuals which are typically credited for bringing the first factories to the United States are Samuel Slater and Francis Cabot Lowell. Please recall that the origins of industrialization is Great Britain. Now, one of the benefits that the United States had was that the US shares a common cultural background with the British. There's a similar sense of law, there's a shared language, the English language. And so even though the United States is geographically far away from Great Britain, the fact that common language, common law, kind of sharing the same cultural background, it's going to allow industrial technology to come or arrive in the United States. And in the case of both Slater and Francis Cabot Lowell, essentially these were people who memorized plans for, we'll just say, textile factories and built the first factories in the US. And this was essentially at the time, essentially theft, because industrial technology was so profitable and so valuable. The British wanted to make sure that nobody else could have it. And so it was actually illegal to take information related to the factory system and bring it outside the United States. Samuel Slater, Francis Cabot Lowell, they memorized the plan. They spent some time in England, came to the US, and built it from the ground up. And so they're typically regarded, Samuel Slater especially, regarded as the quote unquote father of the factory system here in the United States. These two men are not looked at too fondly in Great Britain for having stole the idea behind behind the system. But by the early 1820s, the United States had some of the first factories, off and running, and this would forever change the economy of the U.S. The Waltham Lowell system, named after Mr. Lowell here, call this the first factory system in the U.S. and put all manufacturing under one roof, right? And the key word, or one of the key kind of themes here, is this centralizing. So if we go back earlier to this relationship between the workshop and the putting out system, production was divided up, some of it in the farm family home, some of it in the workshop. The Waltham system, the Waltham Lowell system is putting everything back all under one centralized roof. And the ability for the factory system to produce means that they're going to be able to produce a lot more efficiently. They're going to make goods for a lot cheaper, and it's not going to really bode well for for the workshops and the people who are working in that industry. One thing that the Lowell system did that was somewhat unique is that they hired only young girls to work in the factory, and so these women who worked in the factory were sometimes called the quote unquote mill girls, or the Lowell mill girls. They hired to not just work, but actually to live and work at the factory. So they were some of the first factory workers, some of the first factory workers in the US. So there were plenty of consequences from the factory system, right? This transition from handmade to machine made. So We're going to go ahead and list three of them here, right? What were the consequences of moving to this factory system? So, one is that workshops are replaced by factories. Right? Those workshops are going to go out of business. The many handmade workshops scattered across the country just can't compete anymore. Factories can produce stuff for a lot cheaper, even better quality in those days. It's certainly a dying industry. Another one is the type of worker, whereas before there was a process of learning a craft, right, under the workshop. It was mostly skilled labor. So apprentices, workshops would have apprentices. An apprentice was someone who essentially learned on the job. And if you spent enough time on the job, you could graduate to something called a journeyman. A journeyman had known or picked up on enough skills that they could start to produce stuff, right? So with the shoemaker, a journeyman or the journeyman might actually be producing most of the shoes, and maybe a workshop has 10, 20 journeymen or something like that. The apprentices, because they're new, they're sweeping the floors and getting the coffee, but they're learning how to make shoes on the job. And eventually, once you become a skilled and experienced enough journeyman, you can become an artisan. And an artisan is like a master craftsman. Typically there's one artisan per every workshop, or there could be more. But artisans, they don't really do a lot of the labor. They kind of instruct things, and this is the process in which one graduates, right? You go from an apprentice to a journeyman to an artisan. It essentially takes a long process of skill and know-how in order to graduate that process. This whole process of working is replaced by unskilled wage workers. Because now all of the skill is in the machinery, right? The factory does it all for you. As an unskilled wage worker, you might only need to push a button or pull a lever. For a lot of the textile factories, all it was changing out the spools of thread, right? You put a new spool of thread when the other one runs out, attach it and hit the go button, and the machine does everything for you. And that's also to say that this has kind of built into it a new or different attitudes, right? And I don't think this is explicitly mentioned in the textbook, but this process from apprentice to journeyman to artisan, kind of graduating, learning on the job, there was a certain degree of honor and pride that one took in one's work, right? You were proud after having made the progress of this of these steps, or even when you make something with your hands, you're kind of proud of your work. Your work is unique to your own, right? Every single workshop and every single artisan made things a little bit differently. And so along with this becomes kind of like a loss of pride, right? You might say that there's a certain psychological element to now work being composed of completely unskilled wage workers that you're ready on day number one and the machines do everything for you. You're not really proud of what you've worked because it's not a lifetime worth of accomplishment, which the workshop system was. So now we get to a complete working class of unskilled wage workers. The last thing that we'll say is new classes. And there are several ways of drawing this up, but essentially capitalists and laborers. Laborers, LOB. Yeah, looks weird. Laborers. And the capitalists and laborers, pretty much as industrial society progresses, people find themselves in one of two camps. The capitalists are the ones who own the factories, and the laborers are the ones who work in the factories. Because the factory system is so efficient, it just obliterates all previous methods of production, obliterates all previous classes of laborers, and so you end up having these these two distinct classes. Now, as far as American attitudes towards this new factory system were concerned, it was somewhat divided. There were some who embraced this new factory system because it did have some benefits to it. These ideas would coalesce around what was known at the time as the free labor ideology. This was especially talked about in comparison to slave labor of the South. But Free labor ideology was the idea one could move up the social ladder in industrial capitalism. The reality was that was difficult. That'd probably be a good question to explore, by comparison. So, and what we mean by social mobility, if you're not familiar with those terms or what the heck is the social ladder, it means your ability to climb from the lower classes to the upper classes, right? So, a society with a lot of social mobility means that you can rise and fall pretty easily. Societies with no social mobility pretty much means the class you're born in is the class that you're stuck with. So a lot of Americans celebrated this, free labor ideology, but it's also important to note that there were some people who were very critical of it, and critics would say that industrial capitalism is exploitive. Right, so not everyone embraced this free labor ideology. Now, as far as wage work was concerned, there were a lot of downsides to wage work. We had mentioned earlier that it consisted primarily of unskilled laborers, but wage workers were mostly urban, right, in the cities. Uh, a lot came from the immigrant class. That's not to say that all wage workers or all factory workers were immigrants, but there was a big overlap between the immigrant class and the wage working class. And typically, especially in the early factory system, because there wasn't a lot of rules and regulations concerning labor, low wages. Again, if it's unskilled work, everyone can do it. And if everyone can do it, then you're not going to get paid a lot of money. Whereas before, there's a certain degree of protection around production, right? Not everyone could be an artisan, so you could demand a higher wage. But when the machines do it for you and everyone can do it, especially with high rates of immigration, it means low wages, long hours, and dangerous conditions. Things were not all that great in the factories, right? Dealing with big, heavy machinery, people could lose limbs, they could get killed on the job. Low wages, long hours, dangerous conditions. So one way in which workers thought to, or two ways, we'll say, workers sought to improve their condition was through strikes. Strikes, if you're not familiar, tactic for workers to refuse to work till improvements are made. So if you want better pay or safer conditions, one thing that workers can do is say, look, we're not going to work until you give us more money. Factory owner doesn't want to lose out on more money because if the workers aren't working, then nothing is being produced. So strikes are one tactics. And unions. A union is just an organization of workers. All right. So a union is just when a bunch of workers come together. And unions were an effective way of showing strength in numbers. So both organizing under unions and going on strike, these were some of the ways in which workers sought to remedy some of the poor working conditions of early industrial society. Section 5, changes in gender roles and family life. So we talked about previously how the industrial and market revolutions changed the economy, it changed society, it changed the workplace. It's also going to change gender and the family. And gender refers to, roughly speaking, we'll say the culture and roles that men and women play in society. It's all the actions, stereotypes, behaviors, expectations around what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, essentially gender. So one of the things that changed with the industrial revolution and the market revolution was you had a greater distinction between the work and home, right? That these things became more divided than they were before. And because of that, you had more of a distinction culturally in terms of the workplace and the home place. And this distinction is sometimes, or we sometimes refer to it as the rise of the domestic sphere, right? Domestic, referring to the to the home side of it. So the domestic sphere, we might just call this the idealized. And by idealized, we just mean like what is sought after as as the role to follow, or the plan to follow. The idealized realm in the home that women and children are expected to inhabit, right? And we might say, or we might just make note that this is available to middle and upper classes. Because with the rise of wage labor, again, wage labor, the ability to exchange working a certain number of hours for a certain amount of money, is that it allowed all members of the family to engage with it, right? Whereas before, if we think about a workshop or a farm, pretty much all the families are working together, right? If it's a family farm, husband, the wife, the children, they're all working on the farm. And in fact, for a long time, families actually had more kids because they believed, and rightfully so, that they could provide more labor on the farm. Well, now we introduced the Industrial Revolution, the market revolution. Now, instead of all working on the farm together, families are working separate wage earning jobs. And so the relationship between families and wages, or what we might say, is that women and children can, did, earn wages to the family, support the family. And the idea is that if you are in a working class, right? If you're in a working class, everyone works, right? You're just trying to scrape by. So the men work, the women work, the children work, and they all kind of pool together what wages that they earn from their different jobs together to make a living. But if you are the middle and the upper class, the idea is that only the husband works. So this notion of having a separate home life and a separate work life, and the women and the children are to stay at home and the husband is to work. This was more true for the middle and upper class families, right? That this domestic ideal could be more emulated because they had the economic ability to do that. Whereas working class, right, the factory workers, I mean, they still have. I mean, the families aren't working together at home, but they're all outside of the home, home working. And another way that this manifests itself is in the realm of education. And so you can probably draw a similar conclusion here, and that is, the upper class slash middle class children had access to education compared to working class. If you're in the working class as a child, oftentimes you probably wouldn't even go to school. Public schooling is kind of becoming a thing in this era, maybe a little bit after this, but especially if you're working class, as soon as you're 8, 9, 10 years old, they're yoinking you out of school and they're putting you to work somewhere in order to keep the family afloat. So Again, kind of these themes of the domestic sphere. We can see right here the sphere of the woman, 1850. Education, middle upper class, all these things are closely connected together. This also coincides with somewhat of a shift in the way that childhood was viewed. We sometimes use this term romantic childhood to describe a period where kids could be kids, right? That they were actually out of the labor market and even in some cases out of school. This was made possible. Actually, let's define it first. So we'll just call this the idea to let kids be kids, right? To enjoy a childhood rather than preparing to work a young age. And this is worth noting, right? Before the market revolution, right? Again, I think your textbook uses the term market revolution and industrial revolution somewhat interchangeably here. Industrial revolution is mostly the technology, the steam engine. Market revolution is more about the overall changes to the economy. Remember for market revolution, it's farmers going from growing food to eat it to growing food to sell it. So once they sell it, they're engaging with the market economy. A market is just any place people buy and sell things, right? Stock market, black market, supermarket. It's just a place where things are bought and sold. But before the market revolution, life was an exercise of survival. I mean, it really was, especially for farmers. Do everything in your power in order to not starve to death. And so the idea of letting kids be kids doesn't really work when you're trying to survive. And so that's why you didn't have sort of this romantic childhood, excuse me, emerge until post industrial revolution with the rise of things like the domestic sphere, the rise of education, the rise of middle and upper class families. And so, with all these changes to the role that men and women played, working outside the home, working separately, some families having the affordability of not having some people work, the overall dominating culture related to gender prior to the American Civil War and even afterwards is this notion of separate spheres. And separate spheres is the idea that men and women should inhabit different parts of society. Because before that, it was, somewhat convoluted, right? Especially when you think about the farm family. Everybody kind of did farm work, right? Family work together. For men, the world of business was expected for men. And what was the other one? Business and politics. For women, was consumerism, say consumption, and the domestic, right? At home, raising children, things like that. Now, again, this was the ideal. This was the way that it was portrayed in popular culture, in readings, in literature. Again, could only be enjoyed by some. But an important distinction to make is that this notion of separate spheres, that men and women ought to have different roles and stereotypes and everything else, it did not imply to enslaved women. Enslaved women were expected, not just expected, because um, expected refers more to the culture. Enslaved women were expected and forced to work like enslaved men. On the plantation, there was no distinction between what was considered women's work and men's work. Hard physical labor in the fields was reserved for enslaved men and enslaved women and enslaved children. So this notion of separate spheres it more or less applies to white American society. And these ideas are denied to those who are enslaved. And in fact, a couple of chapters here, in the face of emancipation, when slavery does end, one thing that enslaved families do in the aftermath of emancipation is to recreate gendered roles within the household, something that was denied under slavery. Now, I use both these terms, expected and forced here, because when we talk about things like culture, culture is in some ways the intangibles, right? How do you really put your finger on an idea or an attitude or a stereotype? But a lot of times, culture becomes law, and those laws have more force behind them, like slavery, for example. But another example of the way in which these cultural ideas manifested themselves into law was coverture. And coverture is a law in which married women are legally represented by their husbands. And what this meant was that coverture laws that women could not own property, businesses, could sue, right? Sue or be sued. And even though some states had divorce laws, divorce was difficult. I think we had mentioned coverture laws in an earlier chapter, but when it came to things like, like we said earlier, the expectation was that anything related to business and politics, that was reserved for men in American society, that manifested itself in laws like coverture laws, which more or less put all the decision making and all the legal representation in the husbands and denied women some of those rights. Now, one additional thing that we'll say about family life as far as the industrial and market revolution is concerned is once again moving from this state of survival. And not to put too much into this, because certainly for working class families it was an exercise of survival, but maybe a different type of survival, was that marriages change, right? What might we say, survival to money making, right? If we use the market revolution as an example, right? Farming was not just about surviving, farming was about making as much money as possible. And when you're talking about a capitalist economy, that becomes the end game, right? Try to make as much money as possible. This also shifted marriages, and that is to say that instead of marriage to survive, that is, people typically chose partners in which they had the better chance of survival, whether that's resources or money or whatever that was. More marriages were what they called companion marriages. So instead of marriage to survive, marriage from, or marriage out of. That's probably a better way of putting it. Of looks, attraction, love, etc., etc. All right, the last section, section 6, the rise of industrial labor in antebellum America. And I'm not sure if we've come across this term before, but if you are unfamiliar, antebellum means before the Civil War. So antebellum North, antebellum South. And that's before the year 1860. So, this chapter talks about a lot of the different changes taking place in American society, the various sort of revolutions. And there's one last one here in the section that is worth mentioning, and that is the change to demographics. Right? If we think about the way that the factory system changed, if we think about the way transportation changed, the market revolution changed, The last big change is the change in population, and that is the population of the North really begins to grow significantly. And a major contributing factor to that is immigration. And one way that we might connect immigration with what we already know in this chapter is that when you have things like trains and steamships now, it just becomes a lot cheaper to move from one place or the other. So, in part, some of the technology is helping drive immigration to the United States. And we'll just say about immigration is that during the antebellum period, to use a word that we now know what it means, the US experiences high, in fact, this is the second highest, rates of immigration. Only one other period in American history after the Civil War that more immigrants arrived to the US than in this antebellum period, right? So it's a period of especially high immigration given the US's entire history. It was estimated that one of eight people in the US were immigrants. And when we talk about immigration, whether it's in the antebellum period or really any other period, we typically identify push and pull factors. And this is just a way to help us understand, the hows and the whys that immigration occurs. So push factors, anything that these might be the reasons to leave one's home country, right? So what is essentially pushing people out of where they live. And then the other side of that is pull factors, and that is reasons to come to the US. And typically when we look at something like American history, we're kind of focused more on the pull factors because that's what's going on here in the United States. And sometimes the push factors are often overlooked because what happens in Ireland, what happens in Germany, I mean, it's not really American history, but in terms of understanding, how the United States fits in with the rest of the world, sometimes it's important to go over that stuff. As much as we might like to focus on U.S. history here, the U.S. is part of the broader world, and what happens around the world does impact the United States. And push factors, as far as immigration are concerned, is a good example of that. So, for example, well, first we'll say that Ireland and Germany, these were the two largest immigrant groups coming to the U.S. Right? So we'll maybe just make a particular note of that. That Irish and Germans were the largest immigrant groups. And if you looked at the United States at the time, that's different than what the majority of people are, which are Anglo or English. And interestingly enough, and this is not really a group, so to speak, but the second largest demographic group behind English are Africans, enslaved Africans. In fact, the English enslaved Africans are two of the oldest, again, immigrant groups in the United States. So the Irish and German are different, right? And they're going to come to the United States with, in the case of Germans, different language. In the case of Ireland, different religion in Roman Catholicism. But how they arrive here is the story of push and pull factors. So for the Irish, we can identify the pull factors. Sorry, let's do push first. List two, the revoking of common land. Especially in England, as the wool industry begins to pick up, and as industrial capitalism begins to pick up, there's a lot more of a premium on land. And so, whereas land was used as common land before, it's starting to be fenced off in terms of private property. But perhaps the bigger and more notable push factor was the famine. And this, occurred around 1846. And the potato famine in particular led to massive starvation. 1.7 million people fled because there was no food in Ireland. And so, again, why do people leave the country that they come from? Well, a massive famine in Ireland forced from those 1.7 million people who fled starvation, about a million of them ended up in the United States. What's the other side of that token? Well, that would be the pull factors, and the pull factors are economic opportunity. The United States had uh, economic opportunities. So you can think of it this way: if you're in Ireland and you're facing famine, and it's either leave or starve to death. Once you make that decision to leave, there are a lot of different places you could choose from, right? You don't have to go to the US. You can go to England, you can go to France, you can go to South America. So, when you're pushed out of wherever it is you're from, and the question then becomes, well, where do I choose? That's when we start to emphasize emphasize the pull factors. So, as far as Irish immigration patterns are concerned, for the most part, they settled in the city. They were mostly young men, and they typically sent money home to families. All right, so when we think about the Irish or Irish immigration, it's mostly an urban immigration. Now, for Germany, it's a little bit different. In fact, the pull factors for Germany are the same, but the push factors are a little bit different. In Germany, there was a failed revolution in 1848, right? And if you're trying to revolt and overthrow the government and you fail, it might be a good idea to leave, right? Because there's going to be some sort of repercussions for you. And so, because of this failed revolution in Germany, a lot of people who were part of it were looking for a new place to call their home. Now, why choose the United States? Well, it's the same reason. There's economic opportunity. And whereas the Irish tended to move into the cities as young men, the Germans tend to move to the rural parts of the country, and they tend to move with families. So it's German men, German women, German children. They avoid the city, and and they tend to move with families. Now, because of this immigration, right, a lot of people coming from Ireland, a lot of people coming from Germany, and remember the steamship makes it easier to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So whereas before, if we think all the way back to the time period of indentured servants who had to essentially exchange 7 years of their life just for a boat ticket, because the steamship makes it much cheaper, much safer, much easier, it's easier to leave, right? It facilitates immigration. The technology does in a way that hadn't existed before. Now, when these immigrants arrive, whether they're from Ireland or Germany, they come with them a different culture. You mentioned the Irish tend to be more Catholic. There are a number of Jewish immigrants that also show up. We might just add language as well. And because of the Catholic, Jewish, or different linguistic backgrounds, this creates somewhat of a backlash, right? So we might just say that different cultures are met with backlash. Especially, I would say, probably the more visible cases, the Catholics who came in slightly higher numbers or came in higher numbers and tended to settle in the cities where people were closer together, and you can see those conflicts a little bit more visible. And so the consequence of this very high rate of immigration was the emergence of a nativist movement, which might be the first in American history here, depending on how far back you want to stretch it, I suppose. But nativism in general is it's a term that can apply to any country at any time period. It more or less is a fear or concern or even hatred of immigrants who are different than the majority culture. So here it'd be a fear of Catholics, a fear of Jews, a fear of those who speak, again,
a different language. And the nativist movement was especially concerned about the growing presence of Catholics, especially in American urban center. The nativist movement was so strong that it organized itself or manifested itself into a political party, the Know Nothing Party, sometimes called the American Party. And the Know Nothing Party was an anti immigrant political party in the 1840s and 1850s, and it was especially popular in in cities, to elect candidates that would curb immigration or curb the influence of Catholics to try to retain, especially northern states, I would say, of Protestantism and the English language, and it became rather popular. Now, when a lot of these immigrants arrive, especially those that are Irish that are moving into the cities, they become part of the working class, and by being part of the working class, they also embed themselves or become involved in the labor movement. So we might just say, and again, this is something we mentioned before, was that many in the working class are immigrants, right? Again, it's not to say that every single working class person is an immigrant and every immigrant becomes a member of the working class, but there is a close overlap between those two, between those two sections. And so the labor movement gets a lot of, or at least some of its momentum and energy from the immigrant working class who will mobilize with others in order to try to improve conditions. So we have a quote here from Sarah Bagley, looks like a G here, a labor activist who says, quote, who, after 13 hours of steady application to monotonous work, can sit down and apply her mind to deep and long continued thought. So, here talking specifically about the long hours that the working class endured and the type of psychologically monotonous labor. Again, in the factory, it could be as easy as just pushing a button or pulling a lever over and over and over and over again. So, the immigrant class, the working class, they mobilized around a couple of issues that were important to the to the antebellum period. One of them is related to unions and what is sometimes called closed shop or a closed shop union. And this was jobs that required union membership, right? Jobs that required union membership. And that is to say, a closed shop said, look, if you want to get hired, you have to join the union. And the idea was that that would make the union stronger. All right. So that was one thing that advocates for the working class worked on doing, right? Trying to get as many jobs closed shop as possible. Another thing they did was to work on getting the 10-hour workday. This was to reduce the workday. Right? Shorter hours was a strong desire of a lot of those who were part of the labor movement. And the last one is child labor. And child labor was something where you started to see really kind of the first progress on. That was to get children out of the workplace. And in fact, some of the first laws that protect workers ever passed in American history apply to children first, right? Some of the first worker protection laws that limit hours or whatever it is apply to children, and then they eventually spread. A focus on child labor and kind of an incremental progress for the labor movement. That was strategy, and I think it's Massachusetts passed one of the first labor laws, or this child labor law. Massachusetts law prohibited children under, was it under 12 from working 10 hours. All right, so you see the 10-hour workday combined with child labor. Now that's a, if we think about it in terms, again, incremental progress, this is the far way away from the 8-hour workday for adults that we enjoy today. But you had to start somewhere, right? The labor movement had to start somewhere. And, one of the earliest interventions is with children, right? First you start with children under 12, prevent them from working 10 hours a day, and then you work your way up from point. Now, there's one last point that I want to make here about demographics to better illustrate the difference between the North and the South. We had mentioned that one of the major pull factors was job opportunities. Now, those job opportunities were in the factories. Now, let us recall that the factories are located in the North, right, are located in the North. Because the factories are located in the North, when we talk about immigration, it's not something that is spread out evenly throughout the country. A majority of immigrants move to the North. And so when we think about the differences between the North and the South, we'll talk about this a little bit later in a different in a different chapter. In terms of population growth, it's the North that is going to grow more, right? Immigrants seek out job opportunities. Job opportunities are in the factories. Factories are in the North. Therefore, immigration is in the North. And over time, the population of the North is going to grow, whereas the population of the South, it sort of stagnates. And as we move forward, I want us to think about, well, what is the political consequences of this, right? As the North gets more people, what does this mean for their political power compared to the South?